At its peak, the Baldwin Piano Company employed over 2,000 people in Cincinnati, Ohio. They built instruments that sat in the White House and on concert stages across Europe. Liberace played Baldwin. Aaron Copland composed on Baldwin. They manufactured 1 million pianos, becoming the undeniable soundtrack of middle-class America. So how did the institution that built the heartbeat of the American home suddenly collapse into a $9 billion bankruptcy, wiping out the life savings of ordinary citizens and leaving its historic 8-story factory completely silent? This is the story of America's greatest piano empire, and exactly how Wall Street threw it all away. The mid-19th century in the American Midwest was a landscape defined by rapid accumulation and physical exertion. The Ohio River operated as a relentless conduit for raw materials and finished goods, pushing the boundaries of an expanding nation further westward. By the 1860s, Cincinnati had established itself as a massive engine of this new economy. It was a place of iron foundries, meatpacking plants, and dense, humid air thick with the coal smoke of riverboats and rail yards. Wealth was being generated at an unprecedented scale, pulling a new, robust middle class out of the industrial soot. As this new class of merchants, managers, and skilled laborers secured their financial footing, their attention turned inevitably toward the acquisition of culture. Economic survival was no longer the sole objective. The demonstration of refinement became equally necessary. In the parlor of a Victorian American home, there was no greater testament to a family's arrival in polite society than a piano. It was an object of immense physical weight and complex engineering that signaled domestic stability, disposable income, and a commitment to the education of the next generation. Yet, for the residents of the Ohio Valley, acquiring a piano was a logistical ordeal. The American piano industry was heavily concentrated on the East Coast, dominated by the established workshops of New York and Boston. The Midwest was strictly a consumer market, reliant on slow, expensive transport networks to bring these delicate instruments over the Appalachian Mountains. It was within this environment of high cultural demand and inefficient supply that Dwight Hamilton Baldwin found himself, though he had never intended to be a merchant. Baldwin did not possess the physical constitution of an industrialist or a pioneer. He was an inherently frail man whose early ambitions had been entirely spiritual. He had prepared for a life in the ministry, intending to work as a Presbyterian missionary. However, the physical demands of that calling were deemed too severe for his delicate health. The path he had chosen was closed to him by the simple limitations of his own body. Redirecting his life, Baldwin relied on the one asset that did not require physical endurance: his deep understanding of music. He became a music teacher in the Cincinnati public school system. For years, he taught violin, organ, and piano, moving quietly through a loud industrial city. His work placed him in direct contact with the families of the rising middle class. He observed their aspirations, understood their domestic economies, and, most importantly, recognized their frustration with the process of acquiring quality instruments. When parents needed advice on which piano to purchase for their children, they naturally turned to the quiet, meticulous music teacher for guidance. In 1862, Baldwin formalized this role. With $2,000 in carefully accumulated savings, he opened a small retail music store. He did not approach the enterprise with the aggressive tactics of a traditional salesman. Instead, he operated as an arbiter of taste and a trusted advisor. He leveraged his reputation as an educator, selecting instruments from reputable Eastern manufacturers and acting as the intermediary for Cincinnati families. The model was fundamentally sound because it was built on genuine authority rather than mere transaction. Customers trusted his ear, and they trusted his judgment. The retail operation proved successful, but the logistics of moving heavy, sensitive instruments from the Atlantic coast to the Midwest required a level of operational management that went beyond teaching and advising. In 1865, the trajectory of the business shifted with the hiring of Lucian Woolson. Woolson was a young veteran of the American Civil War, originally hired simply to keep the company books. However, it quickly became apparent that Woolson possessed a rare architectural mind for business. He did not just record numbers, he analyzed the systems behind them. While Baldwin possessed the ear and the public trust, Woolson understood credit, inventory circulation, and regional expansion. Woolson recognized that the demand for pianos was not confined to Cincinnati, but extended across the entire expanding frontier of the Midwest. Under Woolson's strategic direction, the small retail shop began to evolve into a sprawling distribution network. They opened branch locations in other cities, establishing a formidable retail footprint that commanded the attention of the Eastern manufacturers. By 1873, Woolson was made a full partner, and the firm of D.H. Baldwin and Company became one of the most powerful musical instrument distributors in the United States. To maintain their position at the apex of the regional market, Baldwin and Woolson needed to offer the finest instruments available. In the late 19th century, no name carried more weight or prestige than Steinway & Sons. Securing a dealership agreement with Steinway was the ultimate validation for a regional merchant. It guaranteed a steady stream of elite clientele who demanded the New York manufacturer's unparalleled reputation for acoustic excellence. For years, Baldwin operated as a premier representative for Steinway in the Ohio Valley. It was a highly profitable symbiotic relationship. The Eastern manufacturer gained access to the lucrative Midwestern market through a trusted local distributor, and the distributor anchored its entire retail empire on the prestige of the Steinway name. But retail dominance, built on another company's product, is inherently fragile. The distributor always remains vulnerable to the strategic whims of the manufacturer. By the late 1880s, the American economy was changing. Corporations were beginning to consolidate their operations, seeking greater control over their supply chains and their retail endpoints. Steinway, operating from a position of absolute market supremacy, reevaluated its reliance on independent regional dealers. The manufacturer determined that it could capture higher margins and maintain tighter control over its brand by establishing its own company-owned showrooms in key American cities, rather than splitting profits with independent distributors. In 1887, the corporate machinery of Steinway moved against its own network. The company abruptly terminated its long-standing dealership agreement with D.H. Baldwin and Company. The decision was swift, unilateral, and economically devastating. In a single boardroom maneuver, Baldwin was stripped of its flagship product. The anchor that had drawn serious musicians and affluent families into their showrooms was suddenly gone. In the mechanics of late 19th century retail, losing a monopoly on a brand like Steinway was generally a fatal blow. An independent distributor could not easily substitute a lesser name and expect to retain its market share. The East Coast establishment had demonstrated its absolute leverage, reminding the Midwestern merchants that they were merely tenants in an industry owned by New York and Boston. Dwight Baldwin and Lucian Woolson were faced with a critical juncture that would dictate the survival of their enterprise. The conventional response would have been to search for a replacement supplier, to find another Eastern manufacturer willing to grant them regional rights, and to accept a permanently diminished status in the industry hierarchy. They would have remained middlemen, forever subject to the next contract termination. Instead, the two men analyzed the system that had just expelled them and made a radically different calculation. They had spent 25 years studying the mechanics of the piano trade. They knew exactly what Midwestern families were willing to pay. They knew the acoustic preferences of the region, and they possessed an unrivaled distribution network that stretched across multiple states. They had the customers, the infrastructure, and the capital. The only thing they lacked was the instrument itself. The severing of the Steinway contract forced an evolution that comfort and prosperity never could have provoked. Baldwin and Wilson decided to stop importing culture from the East Coast. They would no longer operate as subordinates in a supply chain controlled by others. If the established manufacturers would not supply them with a piano worthy of their retail network, they would simply build one themselves. The transition from selling a product to manufacturing it requires a complete reorganization of capital, labor, and risk. It meant abandoning the relative safety of the showroom floor for the unpredictable variables of the factory floor. It required sourcing timber, hiring metallurgists, and understanding the complex physics of acoustic resonance. It was a massive financial gamble, driven by the sting of corporate rejection and the sheer necessity of survival. Yet, the decision was made. The quiet music teacher and the meticulous bookkeeper committed themselves to the industrial arts. The era of D.H. Baldwin as a mere merchant had ended. The era of Baldwin as an American industrial empire was about to begin. The decision to transition from regional distributors to independent manufacturers required more than sheer corporate willpower. It required physical and logistical infrastructure that could rival the entrenched monopolies of the American East Coast. When Dwight H. Baldwin and Lucien Wilson committed to building their own pianos, they did not have to search for an ideal manufacturing environment. They were already standing in the center of one. Cincinnati, Ohio, in the late 19th century, was not merely a populated market. It was a highly optimized industrial node, uniquely positioned to facilitate the exact type of massive, systemic production the two men now required. To understand the rapid ascent of the Baldwin manufacturing empire, one must examine the geography of the Ohio River Valley. In an era before the interstate highway system, commercial viability was dictated by proximity to navigable water and converging rail lines. Cincinnati sat directly on the Ohio River, a massive flowing artery that connected the resource-rich Appalachian Mountains to the expanding frontiers of the West and the Deep South. The manufacturing of a piano is essentially the management of raw mass and extreme physical tension. A single piano requires specific, highly resilient materials: dense hardwoods for the cabinetry, straight-grained spruce for the acoustic soundboards, and heavy cast iron to form the internal plate capable of withstanding up to 20 tons of combined string tension. The East Coast manufacturers, operating in crowded, older cities, were forced to import these heavy materials across vast distances, incurring steep transportation costs before a single instrument was even assembled. Baldwin, conversely, was situated at the point of convergence. Barges floating down the Ohio River delivered premium Appalachian maple, walnut, and spruce directly to the city's docks. Simultaneously, Cincinnati was already a leading center for iron foundries and heavy machining, an infrastructure originally built to serve the steamboat and railroad industries. The foundries that cast locomotive parts could easily be contracted to pour the massive iron harps required for pianos. Furthermore, the city was home to a massive population of highly skilled German immigrants who brought generations of old-world woodworking and engineering expertise to the American Midwest. By leveraging the geographic and demographic realities of Cincinnati, Baldwin drastically reduced the cost of raw materials and labor, creating a structural advantage that New York and Boston simply could not replicate. Yet, producing an instrument at a lower cost was only half of the systemic equation. Manufacturing at an industrial scale necessitates selling at an industrial scale. A factory cannot survive if its inventory sits stagnant in warehouses. The East Coast manufacturers operated on a traditional high-margin model. Pianos were luxury goods, sold for cash up front to the wealthy elite, civic institutions, and concert halls. This model was highly profitable per unit, but it inherently limited the size of the consumer base. Lucien Wilson, observing the economic landscape of the Midwest, recognized a profound inefficiency in this traditional market structure. The region was populated by a rapidly expanding middle class, railway managers, shopkeepers, foremen, and teachers. These families possessed steady, reliable incomes and a deep, driving aspiration for cultural refinement. They desperately wanted the social validation and educational benefits that a piano provided. But they did not have the accumulated generational wealth required to purchase a piano entirely in cash. To bridge the gap between industrial production and middle-class aspiration, Wilson systematically deployed a financial mechanism that would fundamentally alter the American retail economy: the installment plan. While the concept of extending credit was not entirely new, Wilson formalized and scaled it with unprecedented aggression. Under the Baldwin installment model, a Midwestern family could take delivery of a finely crafted piano for a modest down payment, followed by a contractual agreement to pay a fixed amount, often as little as $10 or $20, every month. The implementation of this financial system created a profound shift in the domestic spaces of the American heartland. The piano was no longer an exclusive symbol of aristocratic privilege. It became an accessible right for the working and middle classes. When a Baldwin piano was rolled into the parlor of a modest home in Indiana, Kentucky, or Illinois, it immediately reoriented the household. It demanded a physical space. It required the discipline of daily practice, and it served as a highly visible, polished monument to the family's economic stability and commitment to civilization. For the company, the secondary consequences of the installment plan were highly calculated. It carried inherent financial risk. If a regional depression struck, Baldwin would be left holding thousands of defaulted contracts. However, Wilson understood the sociology of his customers. In the strict social hierarchy of a 19th century Midwestern town, having a piano repossessed was a source of profound public shame. Families would endure significant financial hardship, cutting back on other necessities, before they would miss a payment on the piano. The working class proved to be remarkably reliable debtors. This financial engine produced a climactic shift in the balance of power within the American music industry. The installment plan transformed Baldwin from a mere manufacturer into a sprawling consumer credit institution. Every piano sold on time generated a steady, predictable stream of monthly revenue, which flowed back into Cincinnati with absolute regularity. This continuous influx of capital was immediately reinvested into expanding the factories, purchasing more timber, and hiring more craftsmen. The system became a self-sustaining, closed-loop empire. The factories built the supply, the installment plan guaranteed the demand, and the geographic efficiency of Cincinnati ensured that both ends of the operation remained highly profitable. The geographic tether to the East Coast was finally and permanently severed. Boston and New York no longer dictated the terms of musical commerce in the United States. By observing the natural flow of the Ohio River and the economic realities of the Midwestern working class, Baldwin and Wilson had constructed an inescapable commercial machine. They had successfully weaponized geography and consumer credit, ensuring that the sound of the American century would not be manufactured exclusively on the Atlantic seaboard, but forged in the industrial soot and deep rivers of Ohio. By the conclusion of the First World War, the financial and geographic machinery established by the company had generated a volume of capital that demanded a new physical manifestation. The scattered array of early workshops operating along the Cincinnati waterfront could no longer sustain the sheer tonnage of raw materials flowing in, nor could they output the thousands of finished instruments required to satisfy the relentless momentum of the installment contracts. The production of a piano at an industrial scale could not be housed in retrofitted warehouses. It required a bespoke environment, a structure engineered specifically to manage the volatile relationship between organic materials and extreme mechanical tension. A new spatial logic was inevitable. In 1921, the Baldwin Piano Company inaugurated its central manufacturing complex on Gilbert Avenue. It was an 8-story fortress of red brick, designed with the imposing, symmetrical lines of the Italian Renaissance Revival style. From the exterior, standing massive against the Ohio sky, it projected the image of a permanent civic institution, rather than a site of heavy commercial industry. Yet beneath the aesthetic grandeur, every architectural choice was dictated by the unforgiving physics of acoustic manufacturing. It was a machine designed to be inhabited by human workers. The foundations of the entire system was the meticulous management of moisture. A piano is essentially a living mechanism, constructed of organic matter, placed under immense, constant stress. If the Appalachian spruce, used for the soundboard, or the dense maple of the pin block, retained even a fraction of excess ambient humidity, the instrument would inevitably warp when placed in the dry, coal-heated parlors of Midwestern homes. A warped soundboard produced a deadened tone, rendering the acoustic properties useless and threatening the integrity of the installment contracts that kept the company solvent. To systematically eliminate this risk, the lower levels of the Gilbert Avenue complex housed an extensive network of massive, steam-heated drying kilns. Raw timber arriving from the river docks was immediately absorbed into these chambers, where it remained in isolation for months. The dehydration process was monitored with strict, empirical discipline. Factory engineers treated the wood not as a static building material, but as a volatile environmental variable that had to be mathematically neutralized before it could be trusted on the assembly line. Rising high above the kilns and the bustling production floors was the building's most prominent architectural feature, a towering clock structure that dominated the Cincinnati skyline. To the residents of the surrounding Walnut Hills and Eden Park neighborhoods, the clock was a symbol of corporate reliability, a beacon by which they set their daily routines. In reality, it was a vital piece of industrial survival equipment. The ornate masonry of the clock tower concealed a massive gravity-fed water tank. In a facility densely packed with dry timber, highly flammable varnishes, and airborne sawdust, fire was an ever-present, existential threat. The clock tower served as the apex of a comprehensive building-wide fire suppression system, a pragmatic engineering solution cleverly disguised as a monument to civic timekeeping. Function was seamlessly embedded within form. Because urban real estate on Gilbert Avenue was highly constrained, the manufacturing process defied the traditional horizontal layout of American assembly lines. The Baldwin system moved vertically. Production was organized through a vast network of heavy-duty freight elevators that acted as the mechanical arteries of the building. Raw materials entered the ground floor and were systematically elevated through the 8 stories, gaining structural complexity at each successive level. On the middle floors, the brutal force of metallurgy intersected with the cured timber. Here, the heavy cast iron plates, designed to withstand up to 20 tons of combined string tension, were lowered into the wooden piano rims. It was an environment of sheer physical exertion, defined by the heavy lifting of iron, the tightening of steel wire, and the rhythmic, deafening noise of industrial drills and presses. However, as the incomplete instruments ascended to the upper floors, the environment of the factory fundamentally changed. The higher levels housed the most delicate and critical operations. Here, the exterior walls were pierced by massive, arched windows. Before the advent of reliable, high-intensity electrical illumination, natural sunlight was critical to the manufacturing process. The assembly of a piano's action, the intricate, interconnected system of wooden levers, springs, and jacks that translates the strike of a player's finger into the strike of a hammer, required absolute visual clarity. Thousands of tiny components had to align with strict tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. It was on these upper sunlit floors that the industrial machine intersected with the limits of mechanization, relying entirely on the culture of the human workforce. A machine could cut 1,000 identical piano keys, but a machine could not voice a piano. Voicing, the process of adjusting the density of the hammer felt to achieve a uniform, singing tone across the entire keyboard, remained an entirely sensory, manual act. It required men who had spent decades training their ears to detect imperceptible variations in frequency and resonance. These craftsmen used small needles to prick the tightly wound felt, softening or hardening it strike by strike, key by key. The factory, therefore, demanded a dual culture from its inhabitants. On the lower levels, the labor was heavy, rhythmic, and paced entirely by the speed of the steam engines and the conveyor systems. On the upper levels, the atmosphere was quiet, deliberate, and fiercely protective of its generational knowledge. Fathers brought their sons onto the voicing and tuning floors, passing down strict auditory standards that no corporate manual could adequately describe. The surrounding community became deeply intertwined with the plant, engineering a micro-society bound by the rigid schedules of industrial capitalism, yet fundamentally reliant on the unquantifiable intuition of traditional artisanship. To work at Baldwin was to be subjected to a culture of exacting discipline, where a single structural flaw in one instrument out of 1,000 was viewed as a failure of the entire system. The climactic realization of this massive apparatus occurred constantly on the final inspection floor. An object that had begun as raw, wet timber cut from a distant mountainside, having passed through months of controlled dehydration, brute mechanical force, and hundreds of hours of manual microscopic calibration, was finally brought up to pitch. When the final resonant chords were struck by the chief inspectors, the sound reverberated through the brick and steel of the complex. The Gilbert Avenue building was not merely producing objects. It had become a colossal 8-story instrument in its own right, perfectly tuned to convert raw geography and human labor into standardized, repeatable art. The approved pianos were then loaded back into the freight elevators, lowered to the ground-level loading docks, and dispersed across the continent by rail, feeding the vast, hungry financial machinery that demanded their creation. The precision engineered within the 8 stories of the Gilbert Avenue factory was designed to exert absolute control over organic materials. By the end of the Second World War, the Baldwin Piano Company was forced to apply that same rigorous systemic control to an unprecedented demographic explosion. In 1945, the American economy pivoted violently from military mobilization to domestic consumption. The catalyst for this transformation was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, universally known as the GI Bill. This legislation effectively subsidized a massive reorganization of the American landscape, offering low-cost mortgages to millions of returning soldiers. The immediate result was the birth of the modern suburb. Vast tracts of standardized housing built on former farmland, pulling the population out of dense urban centers and into newly partitioned neighborhoods. This geographic migration presented a unique logistical challenge to the American consumer market. Millions of new houses required furnishing, and the suburban living room was designed with a specific spatial hierarchy. It demanded a focal point, an object that communicated stability, domestic permanence, and a commitment to the newly defined American dream. The piano, which had spent the previous half-century transitioning from an aristocratic luxury to a middle-class aspiration, was now positioned as a standardized fixture of the post-war home. The financial infrastructure that Lucian Wilson had constructed decades earlier, the installment plan, was perfectly primed for this demographic shift. Young families, burdened with new mortgages but buoyed by steady post-war employment, utilized Baldwin's credit system to place an instrument in their homes. Revenue at the Cincinnati headquarters surged aggressively, multiplying nearly 5-fold within a decade. The factory on Gilbert Avenue, operating with the synchronized efficiency refined during the war years, ran at maximum capacity to meet the demands of this sprawling new frontier. However, the suburbanization of America involved more than just the construction of private homes. The post-war baby boom generated an immediate, overwhelming need for civic infrastructure. Entirely new municipalities required new churches, community centers, and most critically, public schools. Music education, previously a private pursuit or a luxury of elite academies, was integrated into the standardized curriculum of the American public education system. Recognizing this massive institutional market, Baldwin deployed a specific instrument designed to dominate it: the Hamilton Studio Upright. Unlike the delicate concert grands built for professional stages, the Hamilton was engineered for sheer durability. It was constructed to withstand the fluctuating temperatures of school gymnasiums, the varied humidity of church basements, and the relentless daily physical punishment inflicted by hundreds of novice students. The institutional placement of the Hamilton Upright functioned as a deeply open embedded long-term acquisition strategy. By securing bulk government and municipal contracts, Baldwin ensured that an entire generation of American children would experience their first physical interaction with music on a keyboard, bearing their name. The sound of the Hamilton became the acoustic baseline of the American childhood. The brand was no longer just a manufacturer. It was an integral component of the nation's educational infrastructure. As Baldwin secured its dominance in the physical spaces of the home and the school, a new technology arrived that allowed the company to conquer the psychological space of the American public. In the 1950s, the television set began to challenge the piano as the focal point of the living room. Rather than competing against this new medium, Baldwin integrated it into their systemic expansion. Television required visual spectacle, and a gleaming concert grand piano provided immediate architectural authority to any broadcast stage. The company aggressively pursued placement on national networks. When the highly flamboyant entertainer Liberace premiered his televised program, he performed exclusively on a Baldwin. His program reached millions of viewers simultaneously, transforming the piano from an auditory instrument into an object of mass visual glamour. It was a masterful alignment of product and medium. Every week, millions of families sat in their suburban living rooms watching an iconic performer play a Baldwin on television, while their own Baldwin Upright sat quietly against the wall just a few feet away. This compounding exposure effectively erased the regional identity of the company. They were no longer a Midwestern manufacturer challenging the East Coast elite. They were the ubiquitous sound and image of American entertainment. The relentless momentum of the GI Bill, the institutional contracts, and television marketing pushed the Gilbert Avenue facility to extraordinary output levels. The factory operated in continuous shifts, a massive engine converting timber and iron into domestic culture. The volume of production completely upended the traditional metrics of the piano industry, which had historically prized scarcity and exclusivity. Baldwin had chosen a different systemic philosophy: democratization through scale. The climactic validation of this philosophy arrived in 1973. That year, the Baldwin Piano Company recorded the production of its 1 millionth upright piano. It was a statistical monument without precedent in American musical manufacturing. To comprehend the scale of 1 million upright pianos is to understand a logistical triumph. It represented an unfathomable tonnage of cast iron poured, an entire forest of Appalachian timber harvested and dried, and millions of hours of meticulous, disciplined labor executed within the red brick walls in Cincinnati. By the time that millionth instrument rolled off the freight elevators, Baldwin had fundamentally altered the acoustic environment of the nation. Yet, beneath the surface of this historic milestone, the very nature of such massive production carried an invisible, structural vulnerability. A manufacturing system designed to run continuously at peak volume requires a market capable of infinite absorption. By placing a piano in nearly every school, church, and middle-class living room that desired one, The company had brilliantly conquered its environment, but in doing so, they had brought themselves dangerously close to total market saturation. The golden era had produced an empire of unprecedented scale, but an empire that has expanded to its absolute geographical and demographic limits is an empire that must eventually confront the impossibility of endless growth. The capacity to manufacture 1 million upright pianos while expanding an international footprint in the concert grand market presented a profound industrial paradox. In the standard ecosystem of 20th century American manufacturing, mass production traditionally required the systematic descaling of labor. To achieve exponential volume, complex tasks were typically broken down into repetitive, mechanized actions that could be performed by interchangeable low-wage workers. The Baldwin Piano Company, operating within the dense brick walls of the Gilbert Avenue complex, managed to defeat this industrial gravity. They achieved the sheer volume of a modern assembly line without sacrificing the acoustic integrity that defined their brand. The mechanism that allowed for this synthesis was not a patented machine, but an exceptionally engineered human culture. To decode the operational power of the Baldwin factory during its mid-century peak, one must examine the specific systemic conditions that forged its workforce. The foundations of this labor anomaly was poured decades earlier, during the most severe economic contraction in modern history. By 1932, the Great Depression had effectively eradicated the American piano industry. The economic collapse, compounded by the rising ubiquity of commercial radio, reduced national piano production to a mere fraction of its former output. For most manufacturers, the immediate corporate response was self-preservation through mass liquidation. Competitors shuttered their factories, auctioned their machinery, and unceremoniously dismissed generations of skilled woodworkers and metalsmiths into an impoverished labor market. At the Baldwin headquarters in Cincinnati, leadership under Lucian Wolfson II analyzed the crisis through a different strategic lens. The company possessed a massive cash reserve, a direct result of the highly disciplined installment credit system established in the preceding decades. Rather than hoarding this capital while waiting for an economic recovery, management made a calculated, unorthodox decision regarding their human assets. They recognized that the ability to build a world-class piano was not contained within the blueprints or the cast-iron molds. It was entirely embedded within the physical muscle memory and auditory calibration of their craftsmen. If those men were dismissed, the institutional knowledge of the company would permanently evaporate. Instead of issuing mass layoffs, Baldwin deployed its financial reserves to retain its core workforce. While the assembly lines slowed to a halt, the craftsmen were not sent home. Instead, the company entered into a collaborative partnership with the University of Cincinnati, paying its factory workers to conduct rigorous, empirical research into acoustic science. Woodworkers who had previously shaped soundboards by intuition were suddenly integrated into formal studies on the physics of vibration, resonance, and material stress. This retention strategy was not an act of corporate charity. It was an act of long-term systemic preservation. When the global economy eventually stabilized and the post-war consumer boom ignited, Baldwin was uniquely positioned. While rival manufacturers struggled to recruit and train new, inexperienced laborers, Baldwin possessed the only fully intact, highly coordinated, and scientifically updated workforce in the musical instrument industry. The psychological consequence of this Depression-era decision fundamentally altered the culture of the Cincinnati plant. The company had shielded its workers from the absolute devastation of the 1930s, and in return, the workforce developed a fierce, institutional loyalty that transcended standard labor relations. Employment at Baldwin ceased to be viewed merely as a wage-earning occupation. It became a lifelong vocation. This profound loyalty manifested in a strictly generational workforce. The factory on Gilbert Avenue operated as a closed, familial ecosystem. The surrounding neighborhoods of Walnut Hills and Mount Adams were heavily populated by Baldwin employees. Fathers routinely brought their sons onto the factory floor, securing apprenticeships for them within the specialized departments. This chain of succession ensured that highly guarded, unwritten techniques concerning the treatment of spruce or the tensioning of steel wire were passed down continuously. The workforce became a self-regulating entity, possessing an internal hierarchy based entirely on technical merit and tenure. Nowhere was this meritocracy more evident than on the upper floors of the factory, in the voicing department. If the lower levels of the building were defined by the brutal, heavy industry of iron and steam, the voicing floor operated with the quiet, intense severity of a monastery. Voicing is the final, most critical stage of piano manufacturing. It is the process by which raw, mechanical noise is transformed into distinct musical character. The hammers of a piano are constructed of densely packed wool felt. When a key is struck, the hammer hits the steel string. If the felt is too hard, the resulting sound is harsh, brittle, and metallic. If the felt is too soft, the tone is muffled and lifeless. The voicer's task is to regulate the density of every single hammer across the keyboard, ensuring a perfectly seamless transition of tone from the lowest bass notes to the highest treble. This cannot be accomplished by a machine. It requires a technician to repeatedly strike a key, listen to the microscopic decay of the sound wave, and then use a small, multi-pronged tool to physically puncture the felt hammer. A fraction of a millimeter too deep, or one puncture too many, and the hammer is ruined. The men who occupied the voicing floor at Baldwin had spent decades cultivating their auditory memory. They were the ultimate arbiters of quality, possessing the authority to reject an instrument that had survived weeks of assembly simply because it lacked the correct acoustic resonance. The corporate leadership understood the irreplaceable value of these artisans. While management enforced strict production quotas on the lower floors to satisfy the demands of the mid-century market, the voicers operated outside the standard metrics of industrial efficiency. They were granted the time and autonomy necessary to execute their craft. This elevation of the artisan within a mass production facility created a powerful sense of pride. The workers understood that they were not merely assembling furniture. They were engineering the cultural voice of the nation. However, this reliance on deep generational artisanship introduced a latent, structural vulnerability into the Baldwin Empire. The system was functioning flawlessly, producing unprecedented volume without compromising reputation, but it was entirely dependent on a specific human demographic anchored to a specific geographic location. The knowledge of how to voice a Baldwin Grand or stabilize a Hamilton upright was not archived in corporate manuals. It lived exclusively in the hands and ears of aging men in Cincinnati. As the company moved through the height of its golden era, a subtle tension began to form. The demands of the global market were accelerating, but the cultivation of a master voicer still required 20 years of patient, localized apprenticeship. The human architecture that sustained the company was undeniably strong, but it was also rigid and entirely immobile. If the corporate entity ever decided to detach itself from this specific community, or if the chain of generational succession were ever broken, the physical machines would remain, but the ability to produce the instrument would instantly vanish. The system was perfect, provided it never had to move. The profound integration of human artisanship and industrial scale that defined the Cincinnati operation was a triumph of mid-century manufacturing, but it was inherently bound to the economic realities of its era. As the Baldwin Piano Company moved through the 1960s, the macroeconomic landscape of the United States began to shift. The post-war boom was stabilizing, inflation was becoming a structural concern, and corporate boards across the nation were increasingly adopting a new philosophy of capital efficiency. Within this new analytical framework, the Gilbert Avenue plant was no longer viewed merely as a cathedral of craftsmanship. Through the cold, objective lens of corporate spreadsheets, the Cincinnati facility was a multi-story liability. It was an aging, inefficient vertical structure situated in a northern urban center with correspondingly high wages, rising property taxes, and entrenched labor expectations. The corporate desire to detach from this costly environment was already taking shape in the boardroom, but the physical decoupling required a catalyst. That catalyst arrived on the night of March 4th, 1964. A massive fire erupted in the company's sprawling lumber yards, situated just yards from the main 8-story factory. The blaze consumed highly flammable stockpiles of Appalachian spruce, maple, and walnut. The carefully curated, raw inventory that dictated the company's production schedule. The event triggered a massive civic response. Hundreds of Cincinnati firefighters, aided by Baldwin employees who lived in the surrounding neighborhoods of Walnut Hills and Mount Adams, fought through the night to protect the flagship building. They succeeded in saving the brick structure, preserving the physical heart of the operation. However, saving the building did not save the institution. The destruction of the seasoned lumber yards provided executive leadership with the perfect, undeniable rationale to accelerate a geographic transition that had already been quietly initiated. Rebuilding the storage facilities and replacing the specialized timber in an expensive urban center ran counter to the new economic models of corporate management. Instead, the company expedited the relocation of its high-volume production lines. Manufacturing was shifted southward to newly constructed single-story facilities in Arkansas and Mississippi. These southern states offered a radically different industrial environment: cheap, abundant land, aggressive municipal tax incentives, and, most critically, a non-unionized labor force willing to work for a fraction of the wages paid in Ohio. This geographic shift initiated the secondary and ultimately fatal consequence of the era. The production of the Hamilton studio uprights, the instruments that supplied the nation's schools and secured the company's massive volume, was transferred to workers who had no generational connection to the craft. The deep, localized knowledge held by the Cincinnati voicers and action assemblers could not be boxed and loaded onto a southbound freight train. The corporate spreadsheets accurately measured the reduction in hourly labor costs, but they possessed no metric to calculate the loss of institutional memory. The physical instrument was mathematically identical, but the human architecture that had guaranteed its quality was deliberately left behind. Yet the pursuit of cheaper labor was only the first phase of the company's structural unraveling. The ultimate detachment from its foundational purpose occurred in the 1970s, driven by a complete shift in executive philosophy. During this period, control of the Baldwin Empire consolidated under Morley P. Thompson. Unlike Dwight Baldwin, who understood the aspirations of music students, or Lucian Wilson, who understood the logistics of distribution, Thompson was a product of modern corporate finance. He was an executive shaped by Wall Street, fluent in the mechanisms of leveraged buyouts, mergers, and acquisitions. When Thompson evaluated the Baldwin Piano Company, he did not see a manufacturer of acoustic instruments. He saw an underleveraged financial asset operating in a mature, slow-growth industry. Thompson recognized that Baldwin's most valuable remaining asset was not its southern factories or its Cincinnati headquarters. Its greatest asset was over a century of accumulated demographic trust. The Baldwin name was deeply embedded in the American psyche. It was associated with the safety of the public school classroom, the solemnity of the Sunday church service, and the quiet stability of the suburban living room. It was a name that middle-class Americans implicitly equated with longevity and reliability. Under Thompson's aggressive direction, the company began to weaponize this cultural trust. He initiated a relentless campaign of corporate acquisitions, transforming Baldwin from a musical instrument manufacturer into a sprawling, highly leveraged financial conglomerate renamed Baldwin United. The company purchased dozens of disparate entities, including savings and loan associations, insurance firms, and even trading stamp companies. The mechanism used to fund this exponential growth was a financial product known as the Single Premium Deferred Annuity, or SPDA. The SPDA was an investment vehicle marketed heavily to retail investors, specifically targeting retirees, teachers, and factory workers looking for a safe haven for their life savings. The premise was highly attractive. An individual would pay a large upfront lump sum to Baldwin United, and in return, the company promised to pay out a guaranteed, tax-deferred interest rate that was significantly higher than standard bank yields at the time, often hovering around 14%. To the consumers, the transaction felt secure. They were handing their retirement funds over to the company that had built the piano sitting in their parlor. They conflated the physical durability of a Baldwin instrument with the financial durability of a Baldwin contract. However, the internal mechanics of the SPDA system were highly unstable. To generate the exorbitant interest rates promised to the early annuity holders, Thompson's conglomerate was forced to continually acquire new assets and aggressively sell new annuities to maintain a constant influx of cash. It was an architecture of extreme leverage, reliant on complex internal debt transfers between Baldwin United's various insurance and banking subsidiaries. The capital generated by the Baldwin name was entirely disconnected from the physical production of goods. It was simply circulating within a closed high-risk financial loop. By 1982, the transformation was absolute. The piano division, the operation that had built the brand, secured the million-unit milestones, and cultivated the generational trust of the American public, was reduced to a statistical footnote. The manufacturing of musical instruments accounted for a mere 3% of Baldwin United's total corporate revenue. The remaining 97% of the empire was composed entirely of abstract financial obligations. The men on the voicing floor in Cincinnati had spent their lives attempting to achieve perfect structural resonance, carefully managing the tension of steel wire to prevent catastrophic failure. The new leadership in the boardroom had abandoned that discipline entirely, stretching the financial tension of the company far beyond its natural limits, relying on nothing more than the fading echo of a once great name to hold the entire structure together. The financial architecture constructed by the executives of Baldwin United was entirely dependent on perpetual motion. The conglomerate required a constant, accelerating influx of new capital from the wall of single premium deferred annuities to pay the exorbitant, double-digit interest rates promised to earlier investors. It was a structural mechanism that possessed no internal equilibrium. In the early 1980s, the macroeconomic environment of the United States shifted, and the variables that sustained the Baldwin United system abruptly inverted. As national interest rates began to fluctuate and regulatory scrutiny intensified, the flow of incoming capital slowed. The conglomerate's massive portfolio of short-term debt, utilized to finance the acquisition of over 200 disparate companies, reached a critical mass. The internal transfers of cash between insurance subsidiaries and banking divisions could no longer mask the fundamental insolvency of the operation. The financial tension, stretched far beyond the limits of sustainable corporate physics, finally snapped. In September 1983, Baldwin United officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The numerical scale of the collapse was unprecedented. The corporation held liabilities exceeding $9 billion. At that time, it was the largest corporate bankruptcy in the history of the United States. The collapse required the intervention of federal regulators, state insurance commissioners, and a labyrinth of bankruptcy courts to untangle the deeply leveraged, highly convoluted holding company. The name that had spent a century meticulously accumulating the trust of the American public was instantly broadcast across global financial wires as a synonym for catastrophic mismanagement and corporate failure. The secondary consequences of this collapse did not fall upon institutional investors or Wall Street speculators. The burden was absorbed almost entirely by the retail consumers who had purchased the annuities. Hundreds of thousands of individuals, retired teachers, factory workers, and veterans suddenly found their life savings frozen in complex legal proceedings. These were people who had sought financial security, relying on fixed incomes that were now trapped within the wreckage of a $9 billion insolvency. The psychological impact on these consumers was profound, driven by a deep sense of brand betrayal. They had not entrusted their money to an obscure hedge fund. They had handed their retirement capital to Baldwin. They had relied on the implicit guarantee of a name that was stamped on the pianos in their childhood homes, their local churches, and their community schools. The corporate leadership had weaponized the quiet, domestic reliability of the acoustic piano to sell high-risk financial instruments, and when the system failed, the cultural equity of the brand was liquidated alongside its financial assets. Amidst the massive legal reorganization, the original piano manufacturing division was legally severed from the bankrupt parent company. In 1984, a management buyout managed to extract the musical instrument operations from the financial ruins. Technically, the piano company survived. It was re-established as an independent entity, free from the crushing debt of the insurance and banking subsidiaries. The leadership intended to return the company to its foundational purpose, building and selling pianos. However, survival in a courtroom is not equivalent to survival in the consumer market. The Baldwin that emerged from bankruptcy was returning to an industry that had fundamentally transformed. The peak of American acoustic piano sales had occurred in the late 1970s. By the mid-1980s, the market was in a state of irreversible contraction. The demographic engine that had driven Baldwin's golden era, the post-war baby boom, had matured. The birth rate had declined, resulting in fewer children entering public school music programs. Furthermore, the domestic landscape of the American living room had shifted. The arrival of affordable electronic keyboards, personal computers, and new forms of home entertainment displaced the acoustic piano from its central position in middle-class culture. The demand for the Hamilton Studio Upright, the durable workhorse that had once fueled the company's massive volume, steadily evaporated. The company found itself operating a vast, aging manufacturing infrastructure built for a million-unit market that no longer existed. The flagship factory on Gilbert Avenue in Cincinnati, which had already lost the bulk of its high-volume production to the non-unionized southern plants in the 1960s, operated at a fraction of its historical capacity. The 8-story brick fortress, once a meticulously synchronized machine of time and human artisanship, slowly hollowed out. Through the 1990s, the Cincinnati facility functioned essentially as a ghost ship. The towering drying kilns were largely cold. The massive freight elevators moved infrequently. The voicing floors, where generations of craftsmen had once passed down the auditory secrets of the trade, were occupied by a dwindling, aging workforce. The company simply could not generate the capital necessary to retrofit the 1921 building for modern, low-volume efficiency. The physical plant had outlasted the economic conditions that justified its existence. The definitive end of the Cincinnati era arrived at the turn of the millennium. In late 2001, the Gibson Guitar Corporation acquired the remaining assets of the Baldwin Piano Company. As part of the corporate consolidation, the new ownership made the inevitable logistical decision. The Gilbert Avenue factory was permanently shut down. There was no sudden catastrophe, no dramatic fire or labor strike to mark the closure. The final piano rolled out of the loading docks, the remaining machinery was powered down, and the doors were locked. A continuous line of manufacturing that had operated on that specific site for over a century was quietly extinguished. The building was left standing, completely silent. The termination of the Cincinnati plant was followed by the systematic dismantling of the company's remaining domestic infrastructure. Production was briefly consolidated at the facility in Truman, Arkansas. However, competing against the heavily subsidized, low-cost manufacturing centers in East Asia proved impossible for a company still recovering from decades of brand dilution and financial instability. In 2008, Gibson officially ceased all Baldwin piano production within the United States, shifting the manufacturing entirely to overseas facilities. When the lights were turned off in the Arkansas plant, the loss extended far beyond the physical machinery or the corporate trademark. The true casualty of the 2008 closure was the final, total erasure of the human architecture that had defined the company. The highly specialized, unwritten knowledge required to build, tension, and voice a world-class acoustic instrument dissipated into the local labor pool. The thousands of skilled workers, the men and women whose physical muscle memory and trained ears had constituted the actual value of the Baldwin name, were permanently separated from their craft. A century of localized, generational engineering was wiped out, leaving behind only the brand name entirely detached from the hands that had built it. Today, a traveler moving along Interstate 71 through the urban center of Cincinnati will pass a monolithic, 8-story structure of red brick. The massive clock tower still dictates the skyline of the Eden Park neighborhood. The arched windows, designed over a century ago to capture the precise angles of the afternoon sun, still reflect the shifting weather of the Ohio River Valley. From the highway, the building projects an aura of absolute permanence. It appears exactly as it did during the height of the post-war industrial boom, standing as a pristine monument to Midwestern manufacturing. However, the preservation of the exterior conceals a profound structural irony within. The Gilbert Avenue factory was not saved from the wrecking ball by an industrial renaissance. It was rescued by the mechanics of modern real estate development. Following the permanent cessation of manufacturing, the massive complex sat dormant, a hollowed-out shell of industrial capitalism. Yet, as the 21st century progressed, the architectural remnants of heavy industry acquired a new, highly marketable aesthetic value. The raw brick, the exposed steel beams, and the soaring 13-foot ceilings, features originally dictated by the harsh physical requirements of steam machinery and acoustic physics, were suddenly prized by urban developers. The factory was purchased, gutted of its remaining industrial infrastructure, and systematically transformed into a complex of luxury loft apartments. The building is now marketed simply as the Baldwin. The spatial reorganization of the structure provides a stark commentary on the shift in the American economy. The cavernous lower levels, where thousands of tons of Appalachian timber were once carefully dehydrated in massive steam-heated kilns, now function as secure, climate-controlled parking garages for imported luxury vehicles. The heavy-duty freight elevators, which once carried the grueling, deafening labor of iron plate assembly, have been replaced by silent, high-speed passenger lifts. The upper floors, where generations of highly specialized craftsmen spent decades ruining their eyesight to voice hammer felts with microscopic precision, have been partitioned into premium living spaces. The demographic occupying these rooms has shifted entirely. The factory that was built by the labor of the working class is now inhabited almost exclusively by the beneficiaries of the modern, abstracted economy. Financial analysts, tech developers, and corporate managers, the monthly rent required to secure a single apartment within the former voicing department far exceeds the annual salary of the craftsmen who originally stood in that exact physical space. This gentrification represents the final erasure of the factory's foundational purpose. The developers successfully preserved the shell of the cathedral, but they entirely sanitized its history. The marketing brochures for the apartments emphasize the historic charm and industrial chic of the property, commodifying the aesthetic of blue-collar labor while entirely divorcing it from the grueling physical reality, the deafening noise, and the ultimate financial betrayal of the workers who occupied it. The architecture remains, but the legacy of the labor has been thoroughly overwritten by premium real estate. The silent, repurposed factory serves as a permanent physical autopsy of late 20th century corporate mismanagement. The collapse of the Baldwin Piano Company was not the result of an inferior product, nor was it primarily the fault of changing consumer tastes, though demographic shifts certainly played a role. The fatal wound was self-inflicted in the boardroom. The profound cautionary lesson of the Baldwin Empire lies in the destructive nature of financialization. When executive leadership under Morley P. Thompson ceased to view the company as a manufacturer of physical instruments and began treating it as a highly leveraged financial vehicle, the structural integrity of the century-old institution was compromised. Wall Street metrics prioritized immediate, exponential returns over the slow, methodical accumulation of quality and trust. The executives extracted the equity of the brand, utilizing the deep cultural goodwill established by generations of careful woodworkers to sell speculative, high-risk annuities. They treated a legacy as a liquid asset. When the financial algorithms failed, the executives were shielded by bankruptcy laws and corporate restructuring. The true cost of the collapse was absorbed by the surrounding community. It was paid by the retirees, who lost their life savings, by the craftsmen, who lost their generational vocations, and by a city that lost a massive engine of its middle class. The tragedy of Baldwin is a definitive case study of what occurs when an American corporation forgets what it actually produces, abandoning its core operational values in pursuit of abstract financial engineering. Yet, despite the destruction of the corporate entity and the sanitization of its flagship factory, the ultimate legacy of the Baldwin Piano Company refuses to be entirely erased. The physical machinery of the company has been dismantled, but the output of that machinery possessed a stubborn, undeniable permanence. Throughout the United States, scattered across 50 states and spanning multiple generations, the acoustic artifacts of the Gilbert Avenue plant remain. In the dim basements of aging Midwestern churches, Hamilton studio uprights continue to hold their tuning, their heavy wooden casework scarred by decades of continuous use. In the neglected music rooms of underfunded public schools, the instruments that introduced millions of children to the architecture of sound still sit against the cinder block walls. Most profoundly, these instruments remain anchored in the American living room. They are inherited objects, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren, often sitting out of tune and unplayed, yet too heavy and too historically significant to discard. They serve as quiet wooden monuments to a bygone era of domestic life. Every time a child sits at one of these inherited keyboards, pressing a heavy ivory key and sending a felt hammer striking against a steel string, a physical connection is instantly reestablished. The resulting sound wave is not a digital approximation. It is the exact acoustic resonance calculated by a team of engineers in the 1930s, executed by the hands of an Ohio woodworker in the 1950s, and preserved within the tension of the instrument for over half a century. The corporate entity was liquidated. The financial empire collapsed under the weight of its own hubris. The brick factory was sterilized and sold to the highest bidder. But the sound, the distinct singing tone of a properly voiced Baldwin piano, outlasted the men who built it and the executives who destroyed it. The company may have fallen silent, but the instruments they left behind continue to act as undeniable, resonant witnesses to the heights of American industrial craftsmanship. As we conclude this documentation of the Baldwin Piano Factory's rise and fall, we invite you to engage with this history. If you found value in this exploration of America's industrial heritage, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel to ensure these forgotten narratives continue to be told. Finally, we leave you with a short prayer. May you and your families be blessed with peace, health, and stability in the days to come. Thank you for watching.